Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Shashkis, and I'm here with Jeff Hamburg, who's Red Light Holland's therapist, an expert in psychedelic therapy, expert around microdosing. And today we're going to be talking about intergenerational trauma and the upcoming holidays and the connection to psilocybin, to healing modalities, and how to have a less stressful holiday season. So, hi, Jeff.
Hi, Shaskas. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm far away from my family these holidays. I just actually did come from a few family visits, and it's definitely really interesting to see the growth I've had in the last few years of reconnecting to my family after, I would say, a lot of disconnect due to my lifestyle choices. So maybe we can bring that up a bit later. But maybe you can just start us off with a bit of a definition of what intergenerational trauma is, how it expresses itself in people's mental health, and in your practice.
Yeah, okay. It's a very good question and a very important question because I really notice in not only clients with psychedelic therapy, but also with hypnotherapy, that a lot of what we're dealing with in the present time goes back a couple of generations. And it's really interesting how that takes different shapes. Um, for instance, well, first let's talk about what intergenerational trauma is. Um, when somebody has a trauma, they have a certain way of coping and dealing with life, and that affects how they bring up their children. So if, let's say, you're grown up in a war zone, for instance, then you're very alert, very vigilant. Your nervous system is really alert towards danger. And then let's say you are able to escape, to immigrate somewhere else, and you bring up your children in a safe environment, but your nervous system is always on the alert of trouble. So you bring up your children also in an atmosphere of danger, even though there is no, let's say, rational danger around you. When they grow up, they also have a relationship to this feeling of danger. And when they have their children, they carry this over to their children as well. But I'm just talking about the behavioral aspects of intergenerational trauma. I think you're going to discuss a little bit about genetics as well, but this is more the behavioral aspects. So what happens is that even after 2 or 3 generations, people are still very vigilant or alert, or they have strange relationship to attachments. They have strange relationships to the world around them. Often it shows itself in money, how they relate to saving money or spending money, because that also has to do with if you're feeling safe in the world or
Mhm.
not. A lot of anxiety, a lot of depression is also becomes a result of that. So
Yeah.
what we're talking about is trauma from from one generation reflecting in behavior of the next generation. And it's very important to realize that it's not always one to one, because often a child that's brought up with a parent that's very alert and very, very suffocating, let's say, will be exactly the opposite. Will have no sense of danger at all. But it's still related to that trauma that their parents had.
Yeah, it can express itself in very different ways. And as you mentioned, yeah, I would like to talk a little bit about the biological aspects of it, which are really interesting. And still, I would say early research or mid early research. It's been research out for a while now, but parents pass DNA, of course, to their children. But it turns out they don't just pass the DNA; they pass epigenetic markers. And what that means is that which of these genes are going to be open and active and which of these genes are going to be closed and inactive is actually also passed through inheritance. And these markers are actually created based on the parents' environment. So if they went through some type of trauma, this can actually really change the gene expression of the next generation. And this can come both from the mother and actually from the sperm or the ova. And the interesting, I think, part is that it really can affect very low level things like our metabolism, our emotional responses, the anxiety response, our how much cortisol we have, our immune system. All these systems are really, really interconnected and intertwined. And it can be a little bit scary sometimes, thinking about most people, I think, come from intergenerational trauma to one degree or another, because there has been so much war, famine, violence in the past. And we're still, living in this era in some places in the world. But I think what's also important to really state is that you have, or any person has, a lot of abilities to change these gene expressions through what they do in their life, right? Your food intake, your exercise, your meditation practices, all these can really influence the epigenetics, as well as likely psilocybin. And that's quite interesting. There's just, research is mostly in animal models still regarding psilocybin and epigenetics. But in animal models, at least, we are seeing that psilocybin can change the epigenetic factors in neurons. And that's what's actually causing this increased long-term plasticity, because your genes are opening in places that are telling the neurons grow more, connect more. So that's quite interesting, I think.
Yeah, it's also, I'd just like to add, it's very
Yeah,
important that environment has a lot to do with how genetics are expressed. And it's very important to realize that you're not doomed. A lot of people, when they hear about this, they think, oh my God, I'm doomed. I'm going to have this trauma the rest of my life. But environment and what you said, your own practices are very, very important.
totally. It's a bit like, it is a negative bias against you to a degree that or a challenge, depends on your mindset, right? But it is changeable. And I think it's important to understand that and to see how can we change this. And it brings me a bit more to my next question about, psychedelics and indigenous cultures. Do you think that had any, I know you researched that quite a lot. Do you think that had any sort of change in how intergenerational trauma was passed or not passed on?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And it has really two different sides to it. One is the effects of psychedelics, but almost more importantly is when you see indigenous cultures that the family system is oftentimes different than our family system, and psychedelics are used in ritual settings. And these are two really important aspects that we're missing, most of us are missing in any case, in what we call the Western developed world. And that has a big influence on how we deal with things. If we're in a setting of a larger family unit where grandparents are present, parents are present, all the uncles and aunts, all the children, even maybe other families that are second cousin, third cousins, then you're in a setting in which the talking about using rituals to heal are much more family oriented than what we know these days.
Yeah.
And we'll get to that later about talking about the holiday season. But just having these kind of settings is so important. So regardless of the psychedelics, you're still having a setting which is in a lot of ways, much more healthy. I don't want to romanticize it. It's not as if there's no problems in those kinds of, let's say, tribal situations, but you see a totally different dynamic than what we see in the mother, father, 2.5 children and situation. On the other hand, psychedelics are also very important because it's exactly what you said. You're making different connections in your brain. You're seeing things in a different way from a different perspective. It's one of the things that psychedelics do. And especially when you're in these kind of group settings, suddenly you have a different connection with your grandparents, for instance, with your parents. You can see what their place in society is and how that's affected you. And that's why one of the most beautiful things about psychedelics that that have that to offer is that, especially in these kind of group settings, that we form connections. And that's a beautiful metaphor for the mushrooms, of course, the mycelia. That's one of the most important things that it teaches us is connection, and exactly what the mushrooms do in nature.
So when you compare this to how, for instance, ceremonies are done today, when really a lot of the times, if you're in a group situation, you're with people that you barely know, or what are the upsides and downsides of these types of different situations?
Yeah, well, that's very important because it really depends on the, let's call it the shaman, the person that's leading the ceremonies. That person has to be able to create a safe space. It's very important that everybody is seen. And often in these kind of ceremonies, just like you said, people come in anonymously. They don't know each other. And if there's a setting in which people get to know each other, even on a very basic level, because we all share the same traumas, in fact. We all share the traumas of not being seen, of wanting to connect, not being heard. And when we get a chance before the ceremony begins to connect in those ways, to talk about, let's talk about intentions, for instance, of the things that we want to look at during the ceremony, that creates a much safer space for everybody. And you don't really need to know personal biographies of everybody. That's not what it's about. It's about knowing who we are and sharing that with everybody. So,
And have you seen any success with the use of psilocybin with treatment of intergenerational trauma?
yeah, certainly. Yeah. In my own ceremonies, it's not, it's more an individual process that happens. It's not, of course, it's not a group process, but often when somebody connects, especially with an elder, with a grandparent, then they start to realize that, oh, there is a connection from myself to several generations afterwards. And oftentimes after the ceremony, we talk a little bit about everybody's process. And when somebody connects in a beautiful way to a grandparent, or especially a deceased grandparent, that creates such a beautiful connection that other people also start to realize, hey, I have that same experience and same connection. And yeah, I've seen many beautiful things happen during ceremony, after this, especially after the ceremonies and sharing.
Yeah, I've personally been trying to convince like my parents to uh, do something. Like I personally, I've never done a ceremony.
Mm,
I'm more of a take mushrooms and go run around in the forest sort of person.
also
But
important.
with my parents, I would be, curious to do something like that again with the
Mm,
extra safety of a facilitator for mostly for them.
yeah,
Um, and still working on it. Maybe one day.
yeah, yeah.
um,
I did actually have an Israeli family here at one of our ceremonies with their children, and it was really beautiful. The four of them here lying down, taking mushrooms together, and then afterwards talking about it and being much more open and much more, well, less, let me put it this, less subjective in their responses to everybody. People are more open and listening to what somebody's saying. And it was very interesting to see that children were able to express certain things to their parents, which in normal circumstances, if you say, well, you didn't give me enough attention when I grew up. Well, yes, I did. I did the best I could.
yeah.
And then you see the parents listening. Say, oh, wow. Okay. I never realized that. And it's really beautiful. So bring your mushrooms home for Christmas. Invite your parents.
We could talk about that in a moment. We talk about about the
Yeah.
holidays. Yeah, personally, I feel it's helped me see those patterns, the meme transfer, and that helps me be less angry, right? Take it less
Yeah.
personal, see
Hmm.
their trauma, how it's been
Yeah.
propagating throughout the generations, and
Yeah.
then feel the agency, I think, to not propagate it back to them. Because as you're not forgiving, and as long as you're still angry at what happened to you as a child, you're going to respond in that way back to your parents, which causes
Yeah.
this cycle.
Mhm.
And I think mushrooms, because psilocybin, because it breaks down these early life biases, and you can sort of see them literally, like with the visual cortex. Sometimes I can sort of, oh, this is the pattern that my brain is doing, and this is where it comes from. I think that's really a big part of the magic.
Yeah, yeah, but that is almost let's say step 2 or 3 to be able to reflect on that. What I often see is that when children are able to express their anger, to recognize that they're angry,
Oh,
to
I had no issue with that. I was not repressed. No.
Oh, good for you, good for you.
Yeah.
But I often see
A
that
lot
people
of people are, yeah.
yeah, like, wow. Because let's say in a case that you have an angry father, and then they realize that, wait a minute, I'm really angry with my mom that she didn't protect me from this guy. And then it's really difficult to go through that layer, because your mother is then in some ways supposed to be the protector, but you realize, oh, I have a lot of anger towards her as well. And expressing that even to yourself can be very therapeutic. And that's
Yeah,
what,
anything that's been locked down, right? That's been
yeah,
repressed or dissociated, psychedelics will
yeah,
likely potentially unlock and sort of flood you. And that's why
yeah,
sometimes it is very beneficial to have that extra support around you.
yeah.
Um, so why are the holidays such a hard time for us, for many people?
Well, I think it also has a lot to do with what I was talking about, the what I call the patriarchal family system of a mother, father, and 2 children. And especially when the children are no longer at the home, dynamics change, and children tend to grow up, and they start to have their own lives, and then they come back in another situation in which the parents still see them as the children they were even 10, 15, 20 years ago, and they treat them that way. And then you get what we call a transaction between when the parents start treating you as a child, you start acting like a child. And it's very, very difficult to be aware of these different of this dynamic, actually. It almost becomes automatic, and then the child gets really upset and tension arises, and the parents are still in the situation. Oh my gosh, this girl is still this angry girl, and we can't handle her, and
Yeah.
tensions arise.
Yeah, and I think it is like 2 ways. Like I also feel when I go back, it's been better the last 2 years, but when I used to go back, suddenly like all this progress that I've made in life, oh, I'm never angry anymore. I can communicate my feelings, but I would sort of revert. They had that expectations
Mhm.
from me, and I, the environment again, we're very influenced by the environment. I would
Yeah.
revert to being that the sort of younger, more angry self. Um, so
Yeah.
yeah, so there's 2 ways. Uh,
Mm.
and for me, I also feel it's like quite hard. I love rituals, but I love inventing my own rituals. And it can be very hard to go back to rituals that I feel are very rigid
Mhm.
for me. Like, why are we doing these things? Can't we make our own special something? Why do we
Yeah.
need to be in this social dynamic that's been dictated for whatever reason? And different cultures, of course, there's
Mhm.
different of these traditions. But I think that could be maybe hard for somebody of my generation, where we're used to having freedom and creativity and expression, suddenly being stuck in this old school, this is what we're doing type of situation.
Yeah. Okay, but two things about that. The first is, there's no reason that you cannot create your own rituals and even offer that in family settings, even if it's a small ritual. Let's say somebody passed away in the last year, to have a ceremony that you light a candle for that person and invite everybody to tell stories about that person. Even those simple things can open up a whole different dynamic actually in the families. The other thing is that there's no reason also to create your own, let's say, Yule rituals or Christmas rituals or Hanukkah rituals or ceremony of light rituals. Um, I'm sure you know that we did that for Pesach, for Passover, a couple of years ago, and created our own ritual, and it was really fantastic to change it in the way that it became more relevant to a lot of people. And the next year, we had almost 60 people that wanted to come to
Nice.
our Seder. So
Yeah,
there
and
is.
that brings us to exactly to these recommendations of how you can cultivate a family connection. And I think that's very interesting. Like, what can you bring from yourself to customize the
Yeah.
environment, to
Mhm.
customize the ritual?
Yeah, yeah. And it's also very important to realize that in a lot of rituals that we do, they've been, um, let's say, Christianized. They've been brought into our Western society, but they usually have a basis in some psychedelic rituals. And there's been a lot of books published recently, for instance, about the hostie, the flesh of Christ, being a mushroom, and
Yeah.
that when you take
The
the hostie,
immortality key, I believe, is one of them that looked at
yeah,
a lot of archaeological, very
yeah,
interesting.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. And because when you consume the mushroom, you do connect to what we call Christ energy. So it's a much more active way of looking at the rituals, and probably more authentic than what we observe most in most rituals these days.
so do you have any, okay, assuming you're not brave enough to give your parents psychedelics, or would you take a microdose going back to your family, or any other recommendations that are not necessarily around psychedelics?
Well, first of all, I think it's really important to let people know that psychedelics are not legal everywhere. So be
Yes,
very,
this
if,
is we're aiming at our Netherlands,
okay. Okay.
but true, yes, for people in the Netherlands. Um,
Yeah, then
yeah,
it's easier to bring your truffles along with you and take a microdose if that's what you want. But I think one of the most important things is what we've been talking about before, of realizing that there's intergenerational trauma. And instead of um, when your mother says something to you and you feel triggered, to not to realize that the trigger has to do with you and what she said has to do with her trauma. And being curious about that can be very, very helpful. That being said, our parents, our family are our biggest triggers, our biggest spiritual masters. So it's not going to be very easy to do that because you're gonna get upset, and it takes a lot of practice to be able to say, I'm feeling angry, but I'm not going to engage with that anger. I'm going to be curious and ask questions about that. Oh, where is this coming from? What exactly do you mean? Because usually we pick up cues, and they're not often based in reality.
yeah, and this
So
is part of, why we designed also this little mushroom lamp. I'll do a little plug-in, right? To be able to learn how to self-regulate yourself. It sort of connects to your finger, um, and changes colors based on my heart rate. So blues calm. So I'm pretty calm now.
good.
Let's talk about my mother and see if it comes more pink. um, but it also comes, with a deck of cards that you helped us actually create, where you can practice meditation in a more fun way, also with your friends, with your family. Sort of staying curious about each other, while also receiving this sort of biofeedback cue. So I'm just going to do a plug-in, which, this is part of our Christmas discounts on Mushroom and More. If people in the Netherlands go to mushroomandmore.nl, you'll see a 20% discount on selected products, including Wisdom. So if you do want to do a little microdose, or buy gifts that are interesting from the store, please do that. Maybe another thing that has helped me, and I'm curious about your perspective on that, is treating my parents as kids. I feel like I have a lot more patience towards kids. I teach kids sometimes, and okay, they're being a little, let's call it, not rational, overly emotional,
Yeah.
or whatever it is. I have patience, but when my parents do that, I would get quite angry much more often. I'm like, hey, you should have your shit together by now. um, but then doing this role reversal of, like, you know what, I've gone through this whole journey, and that I have had the privilege to do, right? I've been quite lucky, and I have a really supportive partners, and supportive, amazing journeys with psilocybin, and being like, okay, I'm gonna be the parent right now, and let's see. This seems to work sometimes pretty good for me.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a really, really important thing to be able to see your parents as children, because um, this is from a place of non-judgment. Your parents were always children, and that was one of the problems we all have when we're very young, is that your parents um, often, um, I'm being very general, often do not have the capability of being parents. The role of the parent is to keep
Help
the
yourself
child safe,
regulate also.
feed
Yeah.
it, and help it regulate its emotions. But if they can't regulate their own emotions, then that confuses the child. So when your mother or father starts screaming, they're actually being the child, and that puts us into the parent role when we're very young, and we sometimes continue that along when we get older. But it's also important to realize that there's also an adult role, and the adult role is where we want to try to be most of the time when we get older. And when we see our parents acting as children, we go into the parent role, want to take care of them. But it's sometimes a little bit better to be in the adult role, which means they're responsible for their own emotions and for them getting upset. And we're responsible for when we get upset. And that's a very, it's it's postdoc work, really. It's not, maybe not everybody's going to be able to do that this holiday season, but just to notice that when your mother or father gets upset, to look with some compassion and say, oh, that's their thing. Where does it come from? And not try to soothe them, but try to just give them space to be angry.
Hmm. Yeah, it's I think I need some work on that, like not trying to overly control everything, right? Like if things
Yeah,
are not going well, I want them to go well.
yeah,
And that's one of the tools that I've found that can be helpful. Um, Another thing I like to use is a sort of nonviolent communication cards. Basically, just and you can just print them out like a list of your needs and feelings, and
hmm,
really just I did that actually with my mother quite recently, and just like what are your basic needs actually,
oh,
and like what she told me, I gave some feedback what I see, which needs of hers do I see, which some of them I was like surprised to hear, and I felt that's a very deep connection because when you're able to model somebody based on their needs, then you know what they need. It's almost like basic, but we're not ever taught that language.
yeah,
We're always using these tactics of the way I see emotions is a way of or feelings. We tag the world with this somatic expressions. It's more of like a primate. Lower level part of our brain is being active, and then we learn how to use sometimes these emotions to get what we want, right?
yeah,
Like, oh, we cry as a baby, we get the attention. We act aggressively or aggressively. So it's all these different tactics that we're using to get our needs met. But actually, what are our needs? A lot of people don't even know them. And
yeah,
how can we just communicate them in a way that you don't need to be manipulative with your feelings to get that?
yeah. That's really beautiful, Shashkas. I'm
Thank you.
gonna, I'm gonna. I never considered doing that in this kind of situations of just talking about what your needs are. It would be also interesting to invite people to make concrete requests as well,
Yeah.
to take
Hmm.
the last step,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it's very difficult to
Yeah, or ask them
formulate.
like, which of your needs do you feel I am fulfilling and which of them I'm not? And be
Hmm.
like, okay, maybe I can help you fulfill that. And, maybe no, go find that from someone else.
Yeah,
But just being sort of clear about that. And I think it can be very helpful. And you can even make it like a game, like I'm going to guess your needs on one paper. You actually write your needs and we see how much I'm able to guess them correctly.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah. Because often we think that somebody wants something from us, and we behave in that way, and the other
yeah.
person is confused because they say, "Well, I didn't want that. That's not something I want or need."
Yeah,
Yeah,
I feel that's a very, very big thing in relationships, also like, romantic and friendship relationships where we assume the other person is like us.
yeah,
Or like, oh, or everybody's the same. And we
yeah,
all have, some basic needs, but the degree of them and what gets people dysregulated, and what you know is more like your core wounds that are sort of behind the very sensitive needs, I think
Mm.
is very different. And
Yeah.
that's one of the things, when, because you look at these needs and you're like, oh well, I need all of them. So I sort of ask people, which of these needs, if you don't get, do you start getting dysregulated? Do you feel very strong emotions? And
Yeah.
that's the way to sort of identify what they are. And then also, you know, why. You can start thinking about intergenerational trauma, about what you didn't get in your childhood, uh, is where some of these needs might be extremely sensitive.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to ask you, were any of the needs that your mother expressed, did they trigger you in any way?
No, no. Well, we were very calm when we were doing this. I think I was hoping I would get a little bit more of like her to think in depth why these needs are there, and
Hmm.
that seemed to be a little hard for her still to, you know, figure out and go into why.
Hmm.
Um, and a little bit like my reflection to her was, I see a need of belonging and being part of a community that's always been very strong. Well, for me, I'm more of an individualistic person, and that's always been our like, I'm not going to conform myself to her belonging and her community.
Hmm.
So we were able to talk about it quite calmly, and just understand each other better. It was nice.
Yeah. Okay. But I'm not saying that trigger in the sense that you get upset, but trigger
Mhm.
something like just what you said. That's also very interesting because we're
Like
talking about,
open, yeah, like it opened some new understandings. Also
yeah.
just understanding more, like she did say she needed the need for spontaneity and freedom, which for me was, you know, a bit of a surprise. It's not something that I would think about her so much, but
Hmm.
when she explained it, I was like, oh, that's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's also interesting what you said that she expressed the need of community or felt that, and your reply to that is that you're more individualistic. And I noticed that with my when I was growing up as well, that family was very, very important. We were always visiting aunts and uncles and second aunts and
Yeah.
second cousins, and in some ways it felt very oppressive growing up. And that's probably one of the reasons why I moved to the Netherlands,
Mhm.
is to get away from that family part. And then you realize that family is really, really important. Um, and so I guess the dynamic changes as you grow older, but realizing that, okay, this is what I needed as a child, and how do you create that later? And also noticing the difficulties, how difficult it is to create a family. That it's not as easy as we
Yeah,
think.
there's quite a lot of research, and this is, to be honest, one of the biggest reasons. And I am very driven by research, and one of the biggest research about end of life is when you ask people what are their regrets, is not spending enough time with family. So, you know, I'm trying to not end up in that regret, and actually investing in going to visit them and coordinating visits. Because yeah, personally, I'm not going back to Israel anytime soon, where my mother still is, but trying to figure out how we can have that sense of family, because research says it's important. We'll see. I'll tell you at the end of my life if I agree with that or not.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I understand. It's one of the yeah. That's one of the things I'm dealing with as well, connecting with my children. It's also very, very difficult. So I understand.
Okay. Any last recommendations to make this family holiday a little bit more easy or fun?
Well, I think, like I said, curiosity is the most important thing. Be curious about how you're reacting yourself, and try to feel the moments that you're triggered, where when you're feeling triggered in the sense of getting angry, but also want to run away, want to close yourself off, dissociate, to going to freeze. And just notice that and be gentle with yourself about it, recognizing that. And also, like what you said, um, create your rituals. Rituals don't have to be these really huge things, but invite your parents when they're getting triggered, when you notice it, invite them to open up and be curious about what they're doing.
Yeah, I love that idea of trying to bring in your own little ritual
Yeah.
to slowly cultivate a different
Yeah.
environment.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah. And another personal experience, be very careful, because I tried to do this a visit ago with my mother, to start asking her questions about her family and being brought up. And she really felt that I was interrogating her. And says, "Why are you asking all these questions? What does she want to know? What do you want to know?" So I'm just curious. I just want to know. So it's really difficult. Um,
That's pretty funny because, mostly when I'm sure when you were a kid, she was like interrogating you about your life. How was school? So, fine. But what happened? What did you do? Why are you interrogating me?
yeah, yeah, exactly. Now the shoe's on the other
That's
foot. Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jeff. I hope you do have a fun holiday season coming up. And I'm just going to end again with I'll show a QR code here if people want to go to Mushrooms and More, um, specifically the gifts we have for Christmas discounts. And yeah, look at our products. I love wisdom. I think it's an amazing Christmas gift, honestly. It could bring a lot of joy and fun and playfulness into any family dynamic. So try it out and see you later. And if you have any questions, you can comment and we'll try to get back to you. Bye.